Okay, so last Monday we were talking about the three domains that we classify all living things in: eukarya or eukaryotes, same thing, archaea, and bacteria. Um, I think I mentioned this. The one that's probably been in the news the most is viruses. And those aren't on here because viruses are not entirely living. They've got some features in common with living things, and in other ways they don't. We'll get into them later. Very important these days, I think, to make sure people know some basic facts about viruses. But yeah, we've got to go through some more material in order to get into that. So archaea and bacteria we have spoken about. Both of those have cells that don't have nuclei, so we call them prokaryotes. Everybody else we're going to talk about, the cells are subdivided. There's a central blob in the center called the nucleus, and a bunch of structures surrounding the nucleus called the organelles. This happens to be a plant root tip cell. There's a round, kind of blotchy looking thing in the middle of it. That's the nucleus. In the center of the nucleus, the really dark, grainy thing is called the nucleolus, and we will talk later about what that does. We don't need to get into it right now. But both that really dark, blotchy thing and the surrounding halo that is full of kind of dark, grainy stuff makes up the nucleus together. And then surrounding that, you can see a bunch of, there's little white circles and kind of dark gray blobs and various little bits and bobs and bangles, baubles, and beads. Those are organelles. And in a future lecture, we'll get into how many kinds of organelles they are and what they do. For right now, just know that they carry out specific functions of a cell's metabolism. There are some that might trap light energy, some that might generate chemical energy, some that make substances that the cell needs, and so on. They're just specialized for different things. Prokaryotes really don't have those. Eukaryotes do. For our purposes, we'll cover 4 kingdoms of eukaryotes. A domain is divided into kingdoms, and we can divide the domain eukarya into 4. Kingdom Animalia includes animals. Kingdom Plantae includes plants. No real surprises there. Kingdom Fungi includes the fungi. The best known to you would probably be mushrooms, but there's certainly many more types of fungi than that. It's a big kingdom and it's got mushroom. Thank you very much. And these first 3 are mostly multicellular. The body of a mature animal, plant, or often fungus is made up of many cells. It's estimated that your body is made up of roughly 37 trillion cells. The exact number, of course, differs from person to person, but the average number is approximately 37 trillion cells. What's more, animals, plants, and to a lesser extent, fungi show cell differentiation, which means that different types of cells are specialized to do different things. Your kidney cells do different things from your liver cells, which do different things from the beta cells in your pancreas, which do different things from the Purkinje cells in your brain, which do different things from the cuboidal epithelium lining your ureters. You have got roughly 200 different types of cells in your body. Something much simpler like a jellyfish might only have about a dozen, but both of them show cell differentiation. Different kinds of cells do different things. That's true for plants as well. A big tree or something like that might not only have billions of cells, it might have as many as roughly 50 types of cells. Fungi, maybe not quite so much. The fourth kingdom that I'm going to have you guys learn is the kingdom Protista. Many protists, although not all, are made up of only one cell. The body of one of these protists is one cell, and protists don't show nearly as much cell differentiation. This picture shows you a fairly typical single cell protist. There's lots of them in typical bodies of fresh water. You could find these in Lake Conway, for example. You might see them in Lab 2 when we turn you loose with the microscopes. This one's called paramecium, and it's just one cell. It's a eukaryote. You can see various organelles on the inside. And the Protista isn't really a good kingdom because it's basically where we throw all eukaryotes that aren't animals, plants, and fungi. You think my jokes are bad. I had a friend of mine in high school who used to tell jokes like, what do a bald eagle and a brick wall have in common? And the answer being neither one can drive a stick shift. That doesn't deserve a rim shot. To the extent that has any humor at all, it's funny because, you know, the only thing a bald eagle and a brick wall have in common is something that they don't have, you know, the ability to drive an automatic transmission car. And it's similarly goofy to group all eukaryotes together that aren't animals, plants, or fungi, because they don't have much cell differentiation. Classifying things based on what they aren't is not really good practice. The pros divide the Protista up now into multiple kingdoms. We don't really have time to go into this further. It takes me about a week to cover this in Biology 4401. So if anybody really wants to, you can change your major and take the prereqs and then take that. For what we've got to do here, I'll continue to talk about protists, but be advised that it's what we call a wastebasket taxon. It's not really a good kingdom. The things that are in it aren't unified by features that they do share. They're unified by features that they don't. And that's not really the best way to do it. So here's some protists. These happen to be single-celled protists. Every one of those green circles that you see is just one cell. It's got a nucleus. You can see little greenish bubbles and blobs inside each one. Those are organelles. They're green. They carry out photosynthesis, meaning they generate their own food and energy from small molecules using sunlight as a power source. They happen to be in the genus Chlamydomonas, and they're just one cell. They are single-celled eukaryotic organisms. This, believe it or not, is related to Chlamydomonas. In case it wasn't clear, both this one and this one are pictures taken under a microscope. This one is also photosynthetic. It floats in masses in bodies of fresh water. You've ever seen just green scum floating on a pond in summer, it might have contained some of this. Each one of the cells is shaped like a box. The cells are arranged together in long filaments, and each cell contains an organelle. The fancy name for it is chloroplast, but we'll get into that later. And the chloroplast is arranged in a spiral shape inside the cell. So that's an organelle that's making that twisty thing. This particular thing happens to be called Spirogyra, which was also the name of a jazz fusion band in the 70s. And it's made up of many cells. They're strung together in filaments, but all of the cells are the same. So this is a multicellular protist, but it doesn't have cell differentiation. And even seaweeds are considered protists. They look like land plants. You know, they look outwardly like grasses or, you know, shrubs or what have you. They do have some cellular differentiation, but they don't have nearly as much as a full-blown plant would be. So yeah, seaweeds, kelps, nori, you know, that's the dark green stuff that you get wrapped around your sushi. Those would be considered protists. Protists that soak up sunlight and grow by a process called photosynthesis are what we usually call algae. So this sea lettuce right here on the Pacific coast of North America is an example of an alga, and we classify this as a protist, not a plant. Okay, protists have a ridiculously large numbers of ways of making a living. Some protists take in solar energy and take in small molecules, water, carbon dioxide gas, which is just one atom of carbon stuck to two oxygens, and then water, which is of course H2O, and a few other things, and use that solar energy to build up much larger molecules. We call this being autotrophic. Trophic has to do with feeding. It's the Greek root meaning to feed. Auto means yourself. So autotrophic means feed yourself, i.e. you make your own food. Protists like the ones we've seen are also said to be photosynthetic because they use light. There's a slight distinction in that there are some critters that are autotrophic but not photosynthetic. They're autotrophic, but they use other sources of energy rather than light. So they're not quite the same thing. But yeah, some protists are autotrophs, and almost all protists that are autotrophs also do photosynthesis. Sorry, that's a lot. Other protists are heterotrophic. Hetero means other or different. Heterotrophic means you feed on others. They get energy from taking in and breaking down large molecules, just like you. You get the molecules needed to build your own cells and tissues and structures by eating other living things. And by breaking those down, you also get your energy. So you get both your energy and your molecules from eating. You're a heterotroph. And heterotrophic protists are commonly called protozoa. You might encounter that word. And there are some protists that can switch, that can live either autotrophically or heterotrophically or both. And we call these Miley Cyrus protists because they get the best of both worlds. Okay, sorry about that. Sorry about that. Could make a song out of that. They get the best of both worlds. First they soak up some light, then they eat all night. The best of both worlds. Okay, sorry. I'll stop. Come on, Wagner. Protists that can live either way or both are said to be mixotrophic. And this happens to be a mixotrophic protist. It's called Euglena. By the way, I told people that looking for terms that are italicized would be a good way to study. I will never require you to memorize the names of genera and species. So I might test you on autotrophic, heterotrophic, mixotrophic. You do not have to know Euglena gracilis. I mean, unless you want to, but I will never test you on name a mixotrophic protist and you have to write Euglena gracilis. I won't do that. That's in italics because we always put formal Latin Linnaeus-style scientific names in italics. We always put names like this in italics, but you do not have to memorize those. So I'm not going to hold you responsible for Euglena gracilis or from a previous lecture, Lepomus macrochirus, the brim or perch or bluegill, or any of those. I do try to teach concepts by presenting a lot of examples, and I just wanted to show you this. This is green, and it carries out photosynthesis similar to a plant. It soaks up solar energy with a green pigment called chlorophyll, but it also actively swims. And if you put it in the dark, it can switch over and start consuming food. You can't see it, but there's a structure on the end that's pointing to the upper right of this picture that actually can open like a mouth, and this thing can swallow critters that are smaller than itself. Incidentally, that red spot that you see towards the upper right, not upper left, come on, Wagoner. The red spot that you see at the upper left is actually sensitive to light. It's not really an eye, but this thing is capable of sensing light and actively swimming towards it. So this is just a nice example of a mixotroph. It can photosynthesize like a plant or eat like it's an animal. Very important in nature are protists. There's lots of protists that float in either oceans or in lakes. These are some. They make up a large part of groups of living things that we call phytoplankton and zooplankton. Plankton does not only refer to that kind of weird one-eyed guy who, I guess he's not the owner of the Krusty Krab, but he shows up in SpongeBob a lot. Plankton actually refers to living things that float, but don't swim well enough to be in control of their position in the water. Plankton is anything that floats in water and just goes with the flow. There are lots of photosynthetic protists that make up what we call the phytoplankton. These are the photosynthetic plankton. If you've ever seen a pond or a lake in summer and noticed that the water has taken on kind of a greenish tinge, that's because there's lots of phytoplankton in it. Lots of photosynthetic protists that are just floating there, drifting along and soaking up the rays. Those get eaten by free-floating heterotrophs called zooplankton, and there's a lot of protists that are zooplankton that eat the phytoplankton, and both of those are eaten by things like little crustaceans, little water bugs, insects, and those get eaten by small fish that go on to get eaten by bigger fish that go on to get eaten by the giant prize crappie that my cross the street neighbor is always failing to catch. So if you've ever landed a 5-pound largemouth bass or something like that, ultimately it's dependent on phytoplankton and zooplankton. The same is true in the oceans, by the way. The ultimate source of your tuna is phytoplankton that gets eaten by little zooplankton, that gets eaten by little shrimp, that gets eaten by small fish, that get eaten by big fish, that get eaten by tunas, and so on. We'll talk more about that concept of food webs much later on towards the end of the course. And there are protists that cause significant human diseases. These just happen to be a couple of examples that live in the human bloodstream. The blood cells, by the way, are about 10 microns. Micron also means, it's another word for 1/1,000,000th of a meter. Just to give you an idea, human hair can vary a lot in width, but kind of an average human hair is about 75 microns. So you could put 4 of these round pink blood cells together, and that's roughly the thickness of a human hair. On the left, the blood cells are stained that very light pink, but you can see these darker purple squiggle-looking things surrounding the blood cells. Those are single-celled protists in the genus Trypanosoma. In humans, they cause African sleeping sickness, and a different species in South America causes something called Chagas disease. Not prevalent up here, but they're still not things you really want to get. On the right, you can see more of these red blood cells, the kind of pinkish, roundish things right there. And several of them, you can see purple blobs inside the pink. Those are cells of a single-celled parasitic protist called Plasmodium. That's the causative agent of malaria. Malaria is not something we worry about too much here. Globally, it is one of the killers. It's hard to estimate exactly how many people are killed by it each year. They used to say it was about 1 million a year. It's hard to say because many of the countries where it's a problem don't keep very good records of how many people they've got. But the latest estimate I've seen is that today it's a little bit less than 400, a little more than 400,000 people every year, most of them children, die of infection by malaria. There are countless millions more that are infected with it, and it creates this chronic infection that doesn't kill you, but you get these periodic attacks of chills, fever, and headache. So this thing can knock you flat on your back once every 4 days or something like that. How often depends on what type of malaria you've got. This is one of the big global killers. It's one of the things that Bill Gates has been putting a lot of money into trying to come up with better treatments for. There are treatments and preventative measures. Getting them where they're needed tends to be a problem. I won't say more about that, but let's just say that this is a protist that is extremely significant in human global health. People die of these two things. Another protist I'll show you, there are lots of others that cause plant diseases. They can cause damage to crops. This particular one on the left is a protist called Phytophthora infestans. This causes a disease called potato blight. And on the right, you see what a potato looks like that's infected with Phytophthora. Some of you might be here because of Phytophthora, because an outbreak of Phytophthora infestans struck Ireland in the 1840s. The worst year for it was 1847. And because Ireland had a lot of poor farmers that were subsisting mostly on potatoes, 1 million Irish people died of famine and over 1 million more emigrated to many countries, but quite a lot of them to this country. So if you've got Irish ancestry, it's quite possible that they came here because of the potato famine, which was caused by a protist, Phytophthora infestans. So this is a very important group of organisms as far as human welfare goes. Okay, moving on to the fungi. Most fungi, if you look at them under the microscope, look like this. They don't have solid bodies as such. What the body of a typical fungus is made of is a mass of filaments. They're called hyphae. Just one filament is a hypha. Many filaments are hyphae. Each one of these is made up of many cells stuck together end to end, making up a long chain. And then the whole thing is surrounded by a cell wall. And the cell wall of fungi is made of a substance called chitin. Different from peptidoglycan, which is what bacterial cell walls are made of, at least partly, sometimes mostly, and different from other cell walls that we'll encounter. Fungal cell walls are made of chitin. If you have a mass of hyphae, it's called a mycelium. And you may not know the word, but you have all seen a mycelium if you have ever taken food out of the refrigerator that has been in there for too long. You take food out of the fridge and it looks like it's growing cotton balls on it. Or, you leave some oranges out on the kitchen counter for too long and suddenly you notice these patches of blue-green fuzz. That's each one of those is a mycelium. It's a mass of hyphae that extends in all directions and ends up looking like typically looks like fuzz. That's a mycelium. Yeah, I have mildew in my bathroom right now, so I guess you could say I have a mycelium on my ceiling. Wow, that was pretty good. You have a mycelium on your on my ceiling. I was amused. Okay, hyphae. Okay, fungi are extremely common in soil. They're also common in your fridge if you don't clean it out, but they're very common in soil and they'll grow in, around and through all of the little soil particles, creating big mycelia that you don't normally see. But in many fungi, every so often, when conditions are right, the hyphae will start growing together and kind of form these strands that kind of twist together, kind of web together. They thicken and they'll start sticking out above the surface of the soil and putting up reproductive structures called sporocarps. The best known sporocarps are mushrooms. And you're looking at a home mushroom farm. You're looking at it from the side. So those kind of white finger-shaped things up towards the top, that's baby mushrooms that are sticking their way out from the surface of the soil in the mushroom farm. Below that, all of that stuff that looks like spider webs, all of those white filaments that are branching and joining and, kind of tangling up together, that's hyphae making up a big mycelium. So all of these sporocarps are being made by one big mycelium. All of these baby mushrooms are connected underground by all of these fungus filaments, all these hyphae. That's what this would look like in soil. Mycelia can be extremely large. You could have mycelia that takes up, well, I'll show you a really big one. But this one, I'm guessing that's about 10 feet wide. All of the soil underneath that ring of mushrooms in the picture has been colonized by one big mycelium. So there's a network of microscopic hyphae growing through all of the soil in that ring. You're never going to see it. And the only way you can detect it is that mycelium sends up sporocarps up above the ground. And in this particular species, the sporocarps, the mushrooms, are growing up in a ring. I have actually seen this on the lawns of some of the older houses in Conway, typically after a good spring rain. There's places where you can spot fairy rings. People used to believe that the mushrooms grew up wherever the fairies had been dancing in a circle all night. What's really happening is under that circle, there is one mycelium, and at the edges of the mycelium, it's putting up sporocarps. So all of the soil within that circle has one mycelium growing through it, but you can only know it's there because it's sending up the fairy ring of mushrooms. And here's what really big fairies do. The largest living thing in the world is a fungus mycelium growing in the Malheur National Forest in Oregon. It covers 2,200 acres. If you're not sure how much an acre is, it is equal to the size of an American football field, minus the end zones and about 5 yards on either side. A regulation football field is 1 1/6 acre, if memory serves, or close enough. If you prefer, that area is 3.5 square miles or 6 times the size of the UCA main campus. So all of that land has one ginormous mycelium growing under the surface of the soil and sending up mushrooms. This particular species also causes damage to trees, so you can't really see the mycelium itself unless you dug up some soil and took samples. But you can see this huge area of damaged trees, and it's all caused by one ginormous mycelium, largest living thing in the world. This picture doesn't show the largest. That's a forest in Montana. And you can see there's one down at the lower left and one at the upper right. There's these areas where there's tree damage. From the air, they're showing up as looking a little bit lighter than the surrounding vegetation. Each of those patches is about 20 acres, and each one is caused by a single mycelium, a single giant network of fungus filaments, of fungal hyphae growing through the soil, and in this case, penetrating into the roots of trees and causing illness. On the other hand, there are some fungi. We still call these fungi because they've got chitin cell walls, but they are single-celled. They don't form multi-cell bodies. They don't make hyphae, and we call these yeasts. So that's some yeast under a microscope. Yes, this is the thing that you add to bread to make it rise. You're adding living things to your dough when you're making bread dough. Yeah, that's yeast. Yeast is what we call a fungus that doesn't make hyphae. There are some fungi that actually switch back and forth. This is a fungus called Candida albicans. The actual fungi are stained in dark purple, and you can see there are some filaments in there, but there's also some dark purple footballs. This is actually switches between a hyphal and a single-celled stage. We call it a yeast, but it can make hyphae. Other times it lives as single cells. The reason that might actually matter is this one causes human disease. I used to see this in the Berkeley Free Clinic when I worked there as a lab tech, because this causes vaginal yeast infections. And I used to look at vaginal samples under the microscope, and I'd spot this sometimes. It also causes um, babies can get a yeast infection of the mouth. It's called thrush, and it's caused by Candida albicans. So you see this one clinically sometimes. Many fungi have sex, although not all of them do. Here's a couple of fungi having sex. You're looking at the tips of two hyphae that have joined together, and they're in the process of making a new hypha. The two hyphae are of different mating types. Fungi don't really have gender, and you can't tell the types apart by looking, but we might call them type plus and type minus, or sometimes type A and type alpha. So you're looking at the ends of these two hyphae that are joining together. They create a new hypha that has DNA from both parents mixed together. And that new hypha grows up and it buds off little single-celled things called spores that fall off and will eventually sprout into new hyphae that contain genetic material from both parents. So on the left, that thing that looks like a pom-pom on a stick, that stick is this sexual hypha. That stick is the sexual hypha that contains DNA from two different fungi. Over there on the right, that's a picture taken with a different type of microscope. And you can see that pom-pom type stuff is a mass of spores that bud off and then fall off. They might drift with the wind, maybe quite a long distance, but eventually, when conditions are right, they'll sprout into new hyphae. Those sexual hyphae in many species, although not in all, can divide, they can branch and branch and branch again and grow into what we call a sporocarp, also called a fruiting body. And you may not know the word sporocarp, but you've seen sporocarps before. Mushrooms are fruiting bodies. When you eat mushrooms, you're eating fungus sex organs. Okay, and that probably just made several of you swear off of them. But that's what mushrooms are. There's a bunch growing right there. Another type of sporocarp you can see around here. I took that picture in Laurel Park. That's just tree bark. And sticking out from the tree bark, you have a bunch of things that look like little semicircular shelves sticking out at right angles to the tree. We call those shelf fungi or bracket fungi. And that's another type of sporocarp. The actual mycelium is growing through the wood of the tree, quite possibly making the tree sick, weakening its wood. But the part that we see that sticks out of the wood is these sporocarps, these shelf fungi. They make spores on the underside, and the spores fall off, drift away with the wind, and maybe they'll find another tree. You might have also heard of coral fungi, not shown here. That's a typo in the slide. Truffles, similar to mushrooms, but they grow entirely underground. Puffballs, morels, very delicious. Jelly fungi. There's lots of different types of sporocarp out there. There are fungi, by the way, that don't have sex. And we group these in a grouping called the fungi imperfecti, because as I could have told you in high school, life is imperfect if you're not having sex. High school again. Anyway, never mind. On the left, that's the hypha of the fungus that causes athlete's foot. On the right, there's athlete's foot. Similar fungi cause ringworm, which is not really a worm. It's a fungus mycelium growing in your skin. Jock itch, barber's itch, those are imperfect fungi. Green bread mold happens to be another type of fungus that doesn't produce sporocarps and doesn't reproduce sexually. Fungi do cause disease, and the ones you're likely to have heard of are annoying, but rarely that serious. I've never heard of anybody dying of athlete's foot, although I did hear of one person who died of jock itch. That was Captain Hook. But there are some fungi that can get deeper into the body. Those tend to strike people whose immune system is damaged. We say that they're immunocompromised, and those can be very dangerous indeed. That's a sample from the lung of somebody with full-blown AIDS. And the little dark round things, that's a type of yeast. It's called Pneumocystis jirovecii. It's not really a problem for people with healthy immune systems, people whose bodies can fight it off. But people with HIV, this is often fatal if they've got the full-blown disease. You don't die of HIV itself. HIV takes down your immune system, and then you die of diseases that normally you'd be able to fight off. And this yeast pneumonia is one of them. There are fungi that are quite useful to humans. Yeast feed on sugar and break it down through a process called fermentation to create carbon dioxide gas and alcohol. If you add yeast to grape juice, you get carbon dioxide gas and alcohol. That's how you make wine. Usually you'd let the carbon dioxide go, but if you trap it in the bottle and keep it, you've got sparkling wine. If you feed yeast to a sweet solution made from grain, and you keep both the alcohol and the carbon dioxide, you've got beer. If you add yeast to a dough that contains some sugar, the yeast will break down the sugar, they'll make alcohol and carbon dioxide, and then if you bake the dough, you've got bread. The bubbles in a nice light and fluffy loaf of bread are caused by yeast growing in the dough, breaking down the sugar in the dough and producing alcohol and carbon dioxide. If you're wondering why you don't get drunk from eating bread, it's because the baking process kills the yeast and makes the alcohol evaporate. So that's why your bread does not have alcohol in it. Theoretically, you could get drunk by eating an awful lot of unbaked bread dough, but I wouldn't recommend it. You'd probably just make yourself sick before you felt any alcohol sensations. So don't try it. But yeasts are what we use for baking bread and making alcoholic drinks. Mushrooms are, many of them are edible. Although, as they say, every mushroom is edible the first time. Some species can be eaten repeatedly. Others you will only eat once in your life because they kill you. You just, by the way, if anybody's ever wondered, there's no simple way to always tell whether a mushroom is edible or poisonous. You just have to learn to recognize them from somebody who knows. Truffles are fungi. There are foods that are made with fungi, not just bread and beer, but soy sauce and miso, the stuff in Japanese soups that's so good. Fungi are deliberately added to things like blue cheese. The blue veins in blue cheese is fungi growing in the cheese. It's deliberately added to give it that flavor. There's even fungi that are commercially grown to produce meat substitutes. The name that they're sold under is corn. And you can buy these in, I took this picture at the Kroger on Salem Street. So you can get fungus meat substitute. And last but not least, fungi produce antibiotics. Not all do, but a fungus called penicillium produces a chemical called penicillin, and from that you can make derivatives like ampicillin, cloxacillin, and things like that. There's lots of them. And penicillin is made by growing these fungi in great big vats and then harvesting the antibiotic and then purifying it and making it ready to administer. So very, very important critters are the fungi. And I'll stop the recording now.